Welcome to this ESN conversation. My name is Bob Truby. I serve as the director of the Emerging Scholars Network, and we'll be in conversation today with Michael Kibbe. Michael is the associate professor of biblical studies and dean of communication and theology at Great Northern University in Spokane, Washington. He's the author of Godly Fear or Ungodly Failure, Hebrews 12 and the Sinai Theophanies, and he's written for journals such as Biblica, Theology Today, and the Journal of Theological Studies. We're going to be talking today about another book that Michael has written, From Research to Teaching, A Guide to Beginning Your Classroom Career. That book launched about a week ago with InterVarsity Press, and it is available for those viewing this video for a limited time at this link, https://www.ivpress.com, From Research to Teaching. And if you use the checkout code GFMWeb21, you will receive a 30% discount on that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring Michael on, and we will talk a little bit together about the book and some other things about teaching. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good afternoon, Bob. It's good to be on with you. Thank you for having me.
Likewise. Well, Michael, I wanted to start by your book is about the idea of making the transition from graduate studies, which are focused heavily on research, to teaching, which many people do without a lot of preparation. And I wondered for you, what was the hardest thing for making the transition from graduate research to your teaching position?
Oh, absolutely. I think the hardest thing for me, and I've heard this from many other people, graduate school, and I'm speaking particularly of those who more or less do graduate school full time. So they're mostly focused on that one thing for a season. Graduate school is a marathon. You just the same thing day after day after day, and there's little hurdles and little hills and little victories along the way, but mainly you've got this one project you're working on and you just run after that for as long as it takes. That could be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever that is. So there are challenges to that, but there's also a rhythm to that. Get up tomorrow, keep going. And that's sort of the whole thing. Teaching is a series of sprints, back and forth, where you never get up in teaching and say, well, today I'm just going to go back to work where I was yesterday and keep plugging away on chapter 3. Instead, you have 20 minutes until the next thing, maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours, maybe a day or two at the most until the next big moment in the classroom. And so the rhythm going from long and slow and steady to fast and furious all the time is an exhausting shift that happens, I think, for me, for every first year teacher.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. There is a relentlessness about that, particularly the first time you're doing all those lecture preps, isn't there?
Indeed. I was very blessed. My first year of teaching, I was a visiting faculty member at Wheaton College, and I had a great setup in terms of the support I had, the preps I had. The whole thing was really amazing, and I have never been so tired in my life. It was completely overwhelming and exhausting, even in the best of circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Well, when as you lead off your book and you're talking at the beginning of your book about preparing to teach, the first thing you lead off with was kind of surprising to me. And you said, finish the work, get all the work on your dissertation done.
Yes.
What does that have to do with preparing to teach?
Yeah, a couple of things, I think. One is, and this is the norm, right? There was a time at which I suppose, I wouldn't know, but I suppose you would finish your dissertation and you would defend it and you would graduate and you would publish it, and then you would begin your teaching career. And there was a very clean break between the two. And that is just not the case for the vast majority of us. We are adjuncting during graduate school. We are supporting our families in the latter stages of dissertation writing. In many cases, if you're say a third or fourth year graduate student and somebody offers you a full-time job, you're going to take it. And once you take it, you now have to live in both worlds for a while. And my encouragement is you need to finish the job. You began this task, this marathon as a graduate student, and whatever it takes, and I realize there are all sorts of challenges associated with that, you've got to have the closure of finishing that project. And the reasons for that, one is you need to be able to focus on teaching. And it's very hard to focus on one thing when the previous thing is still sitting there hanging over your shoulder. Another reason is I have, and many of us have read dissertations that came out in print 6, 7, 8 years after they more or less wrote the whole thing. And depending on your field, of course, but in my field, if you go 6 or 7 or 8 years, the research has passed you by. And a dissertation is all about being current in its research. And so if you go 5 or 7 or 8 or 10 years, if I read your printed dissertation, your published dissertation, and the first thing I think is you're out of date on your research, I'm not going to read the rest of it. So get it done quickly, so that you can move on with your life.
Makes sense. Makes sense. One of the other things you encourage is finding good mentors.
Mm.
Excuse me. Tell me a little bit about the people that have been important to you, and how do you find those people?
Sure.
Excuse me.
Yeah. A mentor, I think above all, has a couple things going for them.
Hmm.
Number one, a mentor is someone who inspires, enables, equips, right, drives you to become the best version of you. And that's important because I don't want a mentor who inspires me to become exactly like them. I want a mentor who looks at me and says, let's figure out what makes you tick, what makes you work, what's going to be best for you. And so that's hard, because it's one thing for a brilliant professional in their field to say, I did this, I do this, therefore imitate me. That's one thing. Anybody who's good in their field can probably do that. But to take someone under your wing and say, this isn't about you becoming like me, this is about you becoming the best version of you. Um, there are graduate supervisors, for example, to give a sort of counterexample to this, there are graduate supervisors who will say to you as the PhD student, I'm not going to let you publish anything unless I agree with it. Whereas there are graduate supervisors who say, hey, that's good. I don't like everything about it. There are places in which I would disagree, but it's good, so publish it. I remember the first time I took my graduate supervisor an essay I wanted to get published as a journal article. And he read it and we worked through it together. And at the end, he said, I don't buy it. I don't buy your argument, but it's good. So get it out there. And that, I think, is a critical piece of a mentor
Mm.
who wanted me to succeed, not merely me to become like him, and knowing the difference between those two things. One of the ways that happens is that a supervisor or a mentor in teaching is someone who always knows the answer to the question why. So if I go to your classroom and I watch you teach and I see things that are good, that are effective, that are working, and I come to you afterwards and say, why did you do that? Why did you start with that prompt? Why did you break when you did? Why did you respond to that question that way? Why did you say that piece just like that? The best mentors always know how to answer that question. And what that enables them to do is give you the reasoning and not simply the thing to do. So let's say you've got a teacher who's a brilliant teacher who always starts their classes with a joke. And you go and you watch this and you see that it works. But you shouldn't walk away from that saying, oh, I need to start my class with a joke. I need to ask this person, why do you do that? And once I understand the why, then they can help me say, okay, the joke got them here. I want to get there. What's the right way to do that? And a mentor is someone who can talk you through that process. The other thing about a great mentor, and I was so blessed in this, Gary Burge in his book, Mapping the Academic Career, another IVP
Mm.
book, which is excellent. I would highly recommend it for anyone
Yes.
who's having these conversations. One of the things he tells new faculty to do is to go talk to students and other faculty and just talk across the university or the institutional spectrum and say, who are the great teachers? And he recommends you get some 3x5 cards and you hand them out to everybody and say, give me your top 5. And then you collect them all and you just start listing, okay, who shows up on everybody's 3x5 card? Who are the people that everyone across this campus knows are the great teachers? And then you go have coffee with them, you go have lunch with them, you go sit in on their classes, and you start asking these why questions. And so I did that. And one of the names that kept popping up for me in my first year of teaching was an education professor named Mark Jonas. And I kept hearing from different people, he's great, he's great, he's great. So I went to Mark Jonas and I said, help me, mentor me, talk to me. And the thing he did, which was so formative to me, was he was willing to speak the truth to me. So I went and I watched his class and I saw, okay, I understand why everybody put his name on the 3x5 card. He's really good. And then I asked him to come to my class. And so he came to my class, and it was a session that didn't go terribly well. And I knew it didn't go terribly well, and he knew it didn't go terribly well. So afterwards, we went back to my office and we walked in. I remember sitting at my desk, and he came in and sat down and he said, okay, do you really want to know what I think? And I said, yes, I really want to know what you think. And he deconstructed, shall we say, everything that had gone on in the previous hour. And it was revolutionary for me because he was willing to say, Mike, that was kind of terrible, actually. And we need to rethink this whole thing from the ground up. And it was wonderful because he was willing to speak the truth gracefully, kindly, encouragingly, that this is not an opportunity for mentors to beat other people down. It's an opportunity to speak the truth in love, right? The wounds of a friend are faithful, and his wounds to me that day and many days since then were so helpful to me in figuring out how I wanted to do what I wanted to do, because he was willing to be really honest and intentional about that.
Wow. Sounds like a gift that he really gave you a gift.
Indeed, he did.
um, how do you go about preparing a class? How do you think through your class prep?
Sure. So there's an analogy I use in the book of a fractal. So my father is a high school math teacher, or was a high school math teacher for many years. And so I got this from him. A fractal, there's mathematical fractals, formulaic fractals, and there's fractals in nature. So a fractal is an image that looks generally or precisely, depending on the instance, the same, no matter how far you zoom in or out on it. So for example, a head of broccoli is a natural fractal. So you've got a big head of broccoli, and then you cut one piece off it and look at that, and it looks the same. And then you cut a little piece off of that and zoom in a little further, and it looks the same. So I use the image of a fractal because teaching is about figuring out where you're trying to end up. What's your outcome? What's your pedagogical goal at the very biggest level, broadest level, and then zooming in one piece at a time and saying, does this contribute to that outcome at this level? Does this contribute to that outcome at this level? And so I've got an overall teaching objective. This is one thing that guides all of my teaching. And then I have to say, okay, this class, I've got a course on systematic theology. Does it contribute to that outcome? And then I've got one section of that class. And then I've got one session, 1 2-hour block or 3-hour block of that class. And then I've got one reading, and then I've got one handout, and then I've got one discussion question, and then I've got one quiz question. And at every single level of that thing, I'm asking the question, does it contribute to the main outcome? It's very similar. This is something I find helpful as I think about graduate school, because if you're writing a dissertation in the humanities, for example, everything you do is about a thesis. You've got one argument that your whole 80 to 100,000 words is supposed to make. There's one thing. And every chapter has to contribute to that one thing. And every section and every paragraph and every sentence and every word and every footnote has to contribute to that one thing. And if it doesn't, it shouldn't be there. And the same thing is true in teaching. So when I'm prepping a course or a session or anything, I'm saying, how does this contribute to my one main outcome? And if it doesn't, then we're not going to do it. We're going to take it out. We're going to tweak it. We're going to delete it, whatever that is. So that's the first step for me is here's my biggest picture. How does this very small piece I'm working on today feed into that?
I love that. I love the fractal analogy. My son is a fractal geek. Uh, you know, and he had a teacher, an elementary school teacher, who turned him on to this, and he's 36 now, and he still loves fractals.
Mhm.
Even has even created a fractal coloring book that he published.
Ooh,
So,
wow.
at any rate, I really love the analogy. That one clicks. And when I saw that in the book, I said, I got to show this to him.
I need to get that coloring book. That sounds great.
I'll send you a link.
There we go.
At any rate, one of the interesting things that you mentioned too was the value of having a signature
Mhm.
as a teacher. Uh, Talk a little bit about that and what your signature is.
Sure. So one of the pulpits that I pound and will continue to pound in this process is that teaching is performance. And of course, there's a way to think about that badly, but the point is you are trying to captivate an audience. You are trying to persuade an audience of something. And every little piece of what you do, every mannerism, every word, everything is supposed to be part of that persuasion. And that's performance. Whether it be a musician or an athlete or whatever, you are trying to invite people into a story that you're telling and bring them along with you in it. So teachers, we are performers.
Hmm.
The greatest performers. Now there are so many, especially in the YouTube era. There are countless fantastic performers out there that we didn't know about until we got on YouTube and found them, which is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And I'm showing my age a little bit because my illustrations are all from the 90s. So when I think about, there's a couple names that come to mind of people who had what I'm calling a signature. So Ozzie Smith, baseball player, does a backflip every time he runs out into the field. Now, that flip is not what makes Ozzie Smith a Hall of Fame level performer. It's not what makes him great. It's what makes him memorable. Michael Jordan sticks out his tongue when he dunks. Sticking out his tongue is not what makes him great, but it's what makes him memorable. So a signature is not the thing that makes you a great teacher. But when you add up the number of hours that a college student, for example, has to listen to somebody else talk, has to watch somebody else perform, has to read somebody else's words, thousands and thousands and thousands of hours, the odds are so small that any significant chunk of that is going to stick. 10 years from now, my current students are not going to be able to tell you topic by topic what we covered in systematic theology. They won't, and that's okay. You need something, though, that's actually going to stick. So I don't do a backflip. I don't stick out my tongue, I don't think, in class. But a few years ago, I was invited to start teaching a hermeneutics class. And the history of the class was how to study the Bible had been presented in a very critical perspective on anything that had been done before 1950 or so. So the history of the church, early church hermeneutics, these sorts of things were simply dismissed as kind of foolish. And yeah, they used to do that weird allegory stuff, but now we know better. That was the culture of the class. And I was invited when they gave me the class, fix that. We want to value the church's reading of scripture from the past. We want to do this well. So I started thinking, how am I going to do that? And I didn't simply want to come in and lecture, here's 2 hours of lecture on patristic hermeneutics, and here's 2 hours of lecture on medieval hermeneutics. It's a freshman general education course. Nobody cares. So I don't want to do that. So I wanted to choose a text or a couple of texts that we would simply read what people had said about that text from the beginning all the way to the modern era. So I chose the Transfiguration. So we would read Origen on the Transfiguration, and Chrysostom and John of Damascus and Aquinas and Oscar Romero and a whole wide range of people that my students had likely never heard of, who are coming from very different perspectives. What happened was we ended up spending about half of the course just on the Transfiguration. And I realized, oh, that's my signature. My students 50 years from now might not remember much at all about anything I ever taught them, but they will remember the Transfiguration. And they will laugh every time they think about Peter wanting to build tents. And they will remember that they, like Jesus, will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their heavenly Father, as Matthew says. So there are pieces of that story that are going to stick with them forever. A signature is about being memorable in some way, but, and this is why I don't do the backflips because I can't, but I don't stick out my tongue. I don't do a signature that simply captivates them to me, because my overall course outcomes, that one thing that drives everything, is that my students are passionately being transformed into the image of Christ. And the Transfiguration is ground zero for how that happens. And so even my signature is dictated not by something that simply sticks with them that they'll always remember, but something that sticks in a way that drives that one outcome that I'm going for.
Yeah. Wow. That's tremendous. You know, you you also talk about you talk about class not being done when the class is done, as it were. That reflection is a pretty critical piece. How do you find time to do that?
This is so challenging. The maybe the hardest thing of all about especially year one, that first series of sprints, it's like telling a marathoner, we're going to start running suicides, but I want you to do all these sorts of things in the 2 seconds between each sprint, when you're just trying to get some air. And so especially in those first couple of years, you are just trying to stay alive at that point. And taking the time to reflect and evaluate and process and rethink what just happened in the classroom when you've got another class 10 minutes from now or an hour from now that you haven't started prepping for is so challenging, because it's never urgent. You walk out of class and you're immediately on to the next thing, and you think, well, that didn't go so great. Next time I do that class, I should do it differently. And you move on. And you absolutely will not remember what went wrong and why it went wrong and what you need to do about it.
Yeah.
And so it's terribly difficult, but so important to do that reflection time after every session, every opportunity you get. Now, I will say, I'm sure it depends on the person. For me, probably 4 or 5 years in, you get to the point where you can teach and reflect simultaneously. Meaning you are on stage, you're the performer and you're leading a discussion or you're doing whatever, and you have enough self-awareness that you can be watching yourself teach while you teach. And that absolutely does not come naturally and does not happen the first time out, because the first time you're teaching a class, all you can think about is what to say next and making sure you stick with your notes and you know what time it is and these sorts of just basic things. So it takes a while. But even then, to take 5 minutes, to take 2 minutes, to take 1 minute even right after class to say, okay, I've got my handout or I've got my outline or I've got my notes, whatever I have that's physically in front of me on a piece of paper that's going to go in the binder for next year. I'm going to write something on that piece of paper and say, this point here just didn't land, or this is really good, but I want to tweak this part of it. Or nobody had any idea what I was talking about when I said that. I need to define my terms a little better. Or I mean, some of the most fun instances are when I'll ask a question and you can tell that the question just didn't, nobody knows what I'm asking. But then if I'm lucky, a student will say something like, I think you're asking this. And everybody nods their head. And I say, oh, that's how I need to word the question next time. Yeah. Don't word it the way I worded it, word it the way they did it. And writing that down. So the reflection process is forcing yourself. I mean, it's a discipline and a hard one to go back right away. Because if I don't write it down right away, I won't remember what I did wrong. I'll just end up doing the same thing wrong again next semester or next year, whatever it is. This is the beauty, by the way. If you can get two sections of the same class, then you can do it in between the two. So I used to teach hermeneutics from 7 to 10:30, and then again at noon, from noon to 3 or noon to 2:30, something like that. And so I had a 2-hour chunk in between the two sections. I did all sorts of reflection in between them. And then I could go try the new thing in the second one. So if you get that opportunity, that's a tremendous gift, to make sure you use that little time slot in there to reflect, because we won't remember. And there's nothing more frustrating than coming back next year and saying, gosh, I remember this didn't go well, but I couldn't tell you how, so I don't know what to do about it. And then you do it all over again, have the same experience. And that's not how we want to do this.
Okay, true confessions time. What was one of your epic classroom fails?
Oh,
And,
there were so many.
and what were your reflections on it?
Sure. I can think of two come to mind. In my very first semester, maybe second semester of teaching, I was teaching New Testament survey, and we were doing Galatians. So this is 4 or 5 weeks into the semester, maybe 6 weeks in. So we've been around a little while. There's a little bit of relational equity. I have 25 to 30 students from all different majors, and we spent 2 hours on Galatians. And I'd never taught Galatians before. I think it was my first term, so I was brand new to this. I taught Galatians for 2 hours, and I walked out of the classroom thinking nobody has any idea what just happened. I don't even know what point I was trying to make, but they didn't get there. And I'm fortunate, and this is one of the psychological benefits to this process. When you're a grad student and maybe you give your one annual conference presentation and it bombs, as it will, you have to wait a whole nother year to do another one. And so you stew about it for a year, which is a painful thing to do. The advantage of the sprint is this happened on Tuesday morning. I'm going back to that class on Thursday. So I had far less time to stew, but I had 2 days to decide what to do about it. And so I came back into class the next session on Thursday and said, by the way, I'm pretty sure nobody understands anything about Galatians. And everybody nodded their heads like, yep, I have no idea what you were trying to do last session. And a student raised his hand, a student with whom I had some relationship, and a student raised his hand and said, so Kibbe, what you're telling us is we didn't learn anything because you didn't teach us anything. And I said, yes, that's exactly what happened. And so we spent 2 more hours on Galatians and made some progress. So in that instance, I had to say, I didn't teach. And I think that's so critical to this whole process, is when I walk out of a session thinking that went terribly, I do not default to what was the matter with them. I default to what did I do? What could I have tried differently? What could I have adjusted to on the fly? What do I need to do next time? And in that instance, I thought, no, that I need them to know what's going on here. So I need to figure out what's going on here. And then I need to figure out how to communicate it differently. Another one that comes to mind, which is a simpler one. So I was teaching Greek for the first time, first year Greek grammar, which is a lot of data. It's a lot of vocabulary. It's a lot of charts. It's a lot of forms. And we were doing adjectives, and Greek has a particular way of structuring adjectives, and the adjective and the noun and where the definite article goes to indicate whether or not this is an attributive adjective. So something like the good person, or a predicate adjective, the person is good. And you have to know, do I stick the verb in there or not? So it's a fairly simple first semester Greek kind of thing. And so I taught them, the definite article goes here, the noun goes here. This is what it looks like. And I had created a translation assignment for them, just a whole bunch of short phrases and sentences. And I had created most of them wrong. So they were clearly in context, they were attributive position, the good person, but I'd put the definite article in the wrong place, predicate position, the person is good. So I teach them the things, so I should know how to do this because I taught them. And then I made them all wrong in the handout. And about an hour or so after class, a student comes to my office, and he comes in and he puts the handout on the table and he says, "Are these wrong?" And I looked at him for a second. And I said, "Yep, they're wrong, every one of them."
Mm.
And he said, is this your first time teaching this class?" And I said, "Yes, yes, it is my first time teaching this class." And I fixed it. Those are embarrassing and awkward situations, and they're going to happen all the time. It's unavoidable. And the trick is simply making sure you fix them. So before I redistribute that handout next year, those adjectives said better all be in the right places. So there's a couple examples of some epic failures on my
Mm.
part.
Mm. Thanks for sharing those. I
And
suspect
there's
that there's
lots more, but that's a start.
I suspect that people can identify with that, and and think of lots of instances of their own. Uh, I think one of my senses about teaching is it's one of the most humbling things,
Mhm.
um, to be able to try to successfully communicate and connect with an audience, and for them to grasp what you're trying to communicate and catch your excitement. That is humbling work, isn't it?
It is. And I think the encouragement, I guess I would give some encouragement to those in that situation. One is it's going to happen. It's inevitable. It will happen. Laugh at it, move on.
Yeah.
Laugh at it, fix it, move on. The other thing is, as you get further along, and I see this in myself, I'm 6 years into this now, and I see myself starting to maybe lean in another direction. And that is, you start to shrug your shoulders and say, whatever, oh, well, who cares? And there's a temptation, I think, maybe at about my stage, I'm sure there's data on this, you stop caring as much. And I think what happens is in the early years, you care so much because we're so insecure about the whole thing. We feel we bear the imposter syndrome all over our faces. We don't think we belong. We don't feel like we know what we're doing. And so we're constantly paranoid about making a mistake that reveals our inadequacy. But then you get to a phase where you start to become more comfortable and feel more adequate. But instead of taking that paranoid, that maybe healthy fear, that healthy fear just disappears maybe. And what we should do, I think, and what I need to work on now is that fear isn't about me being secure or insecure. It's about, I have a mission in life and God has given me a job to do, and I want to do that well. And so if a classroom session or handout or assignment or whatever fails, the internal struggle isn't what if they don't like me or what if somebody thinks I'm not a good teacher. It's what if the effect that God's word needed to have on them doesn't happen? That's what should drive me to continue getting better and keep improving and keep evaluating and these sorts of things, is not my own sense of inadequacy, but my sense of that God has given me something good to do here and I want to do it well.
Mm. That's awesome. Hey, we've talked mostly about the first half of your book, and I want people to read the book, and so I don't want to give everything away. But is there something that you were particularly excited about in the second half that you might share? You know.
I'm a firm believer in teaching is not, and this is no disrespect to the mailman whatsoever, but many of us think of teaching as like being the mailman. So I take the package and I put it in the box and I walk away, and whatever they do with the package from that point on is not my problem. That's not teaching. And so one of the things I talk about later in the book is how important it is to know your students. And I'm all for knowing data on them, institutional data, sociological data, trends, cultural identities. That's all good. That's not the same as knowing your students, knowing their names, knowing their stories, knowing what they're dealing with. Now, I'll just confession, I work at a small school. So I have an advantage in this. I do not have hundreds and hundreds of students that I'm interacting with. So it is, of course, easier to do this when you have a small school. But I will encourage anyone who's teaching, you have to know your students. So one of the things I do that has been helpful for me, because I have a terrible memory for things, is I have a stack of 3x5 cards in my office. And every time a student walks into my office and we talk and I get to know them a little bit, after they leave, I'm not interviewing them. So after they leave, I take a card, I put their name on it, and I write down whatever I can remember from that conversation. And sometimes it's as simple as where they're from. I should not have to ask a senior, remind me where you're from. I should know that. Sometimes it's other things. What sort of things are going on in their life? What are things that I, as their teacher, might want to be aware of? And I'll say this, and I say this in the book, those 3x5 cards are for my eyes only, and there are no exceptions to that. So that this is not something I'm disseminating to anybody, but I need to know my students.
Mm-hmm.
And that is tremendously important to me. And again, I'm at a small school. There is some easiness to that just based on numbers. But even if you're at a bigger school, when a student comes in your office, look, we don't remember everything. We all interact with way too many people to remember every bit of data on every person we talk to. So we write stuff down and we remember it and we get to know them at that level.
I have a friend who is a chemistry professor at a large university, and in his early years especially, he would get these big sections, big lecture hall. And one of the things he would do with the students' permission was to just take a picture of each of the students and put their name, with their name, and work to memorize all their names so he could call on people by name, even in a very large section.
Absolutely.
And he just told so many stories about students who even were not majoring in he was a chemistry professor, and they weren't majoring in chemistry, but they'd come to his office anyhow sometimes for advice because he took time to know their name.
Absolutely.
It was funny. It just didn't seem like a big thing, but it was to those students that this professor cared enough to know my name.
Yes. And I found, and I think this is probably true in most places, you can simply go to the registrar's office and say, hey, can I have a printout of my
Yeah.
roster with pictures and names on it? And I have found you can memorize the names before they even get to the class the first time. Now, if you've got 40, if you've got 400, obviously the number of people you're dealing with makes a difference, but it is tremendously effective when a person walks into your class for the very first time and you greet them by name.
Hmm.
And of course, there's the student who dyed their hair over Christmas break.
Yeah.
You're looking at your sheet and you're looking at them and you're not seeing them, and you try a name and it's wrong, and you both have a good laugh about it, and they appreciate that you tried because they dyed their hair, they cut their hair, whatever. So you're not going to get that perfectly. But there are ways, and we as academics memorize things. It's part of our job. I mean, I teach languages. How many vocabulary words have I memorized over the years? Well, more than the number of students I currently have, to be sure. So it's not asking too much for me to get that roster a week in advance, 2 weeks in advance, 2 days in advance, whatever I need to say, I want to commit these students' names and faces to memory even before we get going.
Well, this has been great. Final question.
Sure.
Besides your book, which we really do want people to get, what is one resource on teaching that you would recommend that people ought to have in their library as they want to learn to be better teachers?
Absolutely. We've already mentioned the Mapping the Academic Career by Gary Burge. Yep. The other one I would name is by Ilana Bloomberg, and it is called Open Your Hand, Teaching as an American, Teaching as a Jew. And she is a phenomenal teacher, a phenomenal writer. And there are a couple things I appreciate about that book. One is simply her storytelling style. We all know there's nothing like a good storyteller to keep us going. And so she's a wonderful storyteller. The other thing is she teaches not only at the university level, but at the elementary level. And I'm a big believer in recognizing that there are people who teach different age groups, different sectors of society than us, who can teach us so much about pedagogy, about teaching. So seeing someone who lives in the classroom with 7-year-olds and 17-year-olds and 27-year-olds at different points in her career, she's remarkable. So Ilana Bloomberg, Open Your Hand is the book. It's a wonderful book.
That's great. Well, Michael, this has been wonderful. Let's, one more time, I'm going to put up the information about your book so people can get that. The book we've been talking about today is From Research to Teaching, published by InterVarsity Press. It's a guide to beginning your classroom career. If you use the code GFMWeb21 at the InterVarsity website, InterVarsity Press website, you can receive a 30% discount on that book for a limited time. So go and stop by and visit that. Well, we also, as we close, I want to thank you for watching our video today and stopping by. We want to give thanks to Michael, especially for doing this interview, for InterVarsity Press, for their assistance in setting this up. And we want to mention that this interview is brought to you by the Emerging Scholars Network, which you're welcome to join for free at our blog, blog.emergingscholars.org. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to keep up with the latest of what we're doing. We also, this video and other videos are on our YouTube channel, and you can just get to it by tinyurl.com/ESN YouTube. So with that, we'll conclude today, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Bob.
All righty. All righty.
Hey, thank you.